Stuart Nash.
Mr Speaker, thank you. Thank you very much. I rise to speak to the New Zealand Horticulture Export Authority Amendment Bill with pleasure, actually, and I haven't said that recently because there have been a number of bills that have gone through this House that I don't think have been particularly good for New Zealand, but this is a step forward. But there are a couple of points that the last speaker made that I would just actually like to elaborate on. The first thing she said, she talked about promoting brand New Zealand Inc. brand. Now, I think that is vitally important, but the problem we've got is exactly the problem that Dr. Smith alluded to in the House today in question time. We have a real problem around brand New Zealand, or the clean, green, 100% pure, because it's what we go to the world with. This started out as a tourism brand, and it was so successful, it sort of morphed into our global, unique selling proposition and our global competitive advantage. But it doesn't matter what this bill, the New Zealand Horticulture Export Authority Amendment Bill, does, or what it achieves, or how it drives efficiencies. If we don't live our brand globally, then the ability of us to claim a premium of anything grown here, especially in horticulture, is greatly diminished. And I would argue that one of the things that this government has done very poorly is actually manage our global brand. I would say we've got about 5 years to get this right. You know, what we cannot have is another expose that was done by, I think, the Financial Times or one of these big broadsheets overseas that actually sent people over here and blew this clean, green, 100% pure brand out of the water. Luckily, it didn't get much resonance. The Prime Minister was quizzed on it, I think, on Letterman. He made a little bit of a fool of himself, but that's not unusual. But anyway, and it died a death. That should have been a wake-up call to us. It should have been a wake-up call that, you know what, if we don't get this right, then we will turn into just another small economy selling commodities into a growing global economy. I suppose one of the issues I have is, you know, we say that we can feed the world. We can't. We can feed about 40 million people. That's the estimate I've heard. It could be slightly more, could be slightly less, but it's around about 40 million people. We should be aiming for that ultra-premium end of the market, the Chinese market, the American market, the European market. Brand New Zealand has to stand for something. And if it doesn't stand for something, if we can't get a premium off this, then why would people buy it? The last speaker talked about how this bill and the amendments in this bill will help reduce costs. Well, this is quite an old piece of legislation, 1987, and it has been alluded to. So there will have been a number of efficiencies that have already been gained by our growers. But the thing for me is we still live at the bottom of the world. Our transport costs are high, whether we air freight or sea freight. And usually for the sort of products we're talking about, they require air freight, or they require quite expensive refrigerated containered sea freight. So that is still expensive, just getting things into the market. So if we can't get a premium on that, then why would people buy New Zealand? And I say this with a fair amount of skin in the game. From the 70% of apples grown in New Zealand come from Hawke's Bay. The Hawke's Bay at this point in time is absolutely booming because apples are doing well, the grapes are doing well, horticulture is going great guns. We've had a great summer, you know, one of those summers where the rain falls but not too hard, there's enough warmth in the soil, the grass grows, there's a lot of hay around. It is fantastic. But if we don't get our brand right, then there'll be no markets to sell this to. Or if there are markets to sell this to, it'll just be another commodity where it means absolutely nothing. But Mr. Speaker, the last speaker was right in saying that we do need to be smarter in how we go to the world. Now, let me give you one example. We have the Chinese Free Trade Agreement. It is worth a substantial amount of money to our exporters, but well, we haven't got the TPP at all, Mr. Guy. You should know that at the moment. We have the Chinese Free Trade Agreement, which is a fantastic agreement because it works for both countries, unlike some of the others that are out there at the moment. But, Mr. Speaker, what I'm saying with regard to this is taking a grower out of New Zealand and putting him or her into a market where the culture is different, the language is different, the customs are different, let alone the supply chains. It is like taking a New Zealand company and putting them on Mars. It is so different. So what we need to be able to do is aggregate aggregate supply and go to these markets with a certain offering. We know in some areas, like for example, our wine is a classic case. If a winery can't supply enough wine for 12 months of the year, then it doesn't matter how good it is, you won't get these high-end American restaurants, for example, buying it. And it's the same with our products. That's why the ability to aggregate supply is vital. Keeping in mind, this is a voluntary body. There is nothing compulsory about this at all. So if growers don't see value in this, then of course they won't be part of it. I'll tell you one thing I will be interested in seeing, Mr. Speaker, and that is who submits and on what they do submit. I do note from the departmental disclosure statement, excuse me, that there has been a fair amount of external consultation, including obviously all the relevant government departments have been consulted, as is always the case. But I do note that in 2012 and early 2013, there was a discussion paper and workshops in Mount Maunganui and Wellington released. There were these have been endorsed by the growers. So it will be interesting to see the sort of feedback that comes in. It may be one of those bills where the work has been done, there's nothing more to add, you get the officials coming in from the various departments and saying this is fantastic and it goes through like that. I would be surprised. What I think we will see, and I don't sit on the select committee, I must admit, but what I think we will see is a number of growers coming in and using this as an opportunity to send a message to the government that we do need to do these things better. We are an export-led economy, we are a primary industries-based economy, and it is important that we do get things right. And this is just one of those steps. It's why we're very supportive of it, and and as Damien O'Connor alluded to, it has been around, well, most of the speakers have actually alluded to, it has been around since 1987. But the world has changed significantly since 1987, Mr. Speaker. We know this, and that is why we do need the mechanisms to be a lot more sophisticated, a lot smarter, a lot more engaged in the way we do things. Channels to market is a classic case. You aggregate supply, and this has happened well in the timber industry, not so much in the log industry, which is a bit of a disaster at the moment, but in the timber industry there is a classic case of a company that what it does is it goes around the various sawmills, it aggregates supply and it meets demand. So we're basically talking about a trader here, Mr. Speaker. Traders have been around since the ancient Greeks and beforehand. But this is about doing it smarter. And what it is also recognising is that certain growers and manufacturers have a core competency, and that core competency is not necessarily international market development or international marketing. And I think that is fair enough because, as mentioned, it costs a lot of money, for example, for even a large grower to have an office in China, or to hire an international market development manager or an international marketing manager, let alone having understanding supply chains and all those various things that it takes to actually get product into market. So this is timely. It perhaps should have been done a couple of years earlier, but that's okay. Let's just, this is what we're dealing with now. But as mentioned, it will be very interesting to see what the submitters do and how this piece of legislation does come back to the House after the select committee process. But if I can just leave, the one takeaway I would like to leave, Mr. Speaker, is I just would like to really reiterate that we have got to get our global brand offering sorted. We've got to start living this brand. Because if we don't, if what we're taking to the market is exposed as a falsehood, and I'm not going to say a lie, but certainly a falsehood, then we run the very real risk of not only damaging our global competitive advantage, but destroying it. And we simply cannot afford to have that happen. And I wonder if any of the submitters are going to be talking about that, because I would urge them to do this. They can digress slightly. Select committees allow them to do that, and I'm sure the chair will allow this as well. But we do support this. It's a timely piece of legislation. Bring it on. Let's hope it's in place before too long, because this is the sort of thing we need to see. Thank you very much.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. And to the contrary, the ayes have it.
New Zealand Horticultural Export Authority Amendment Bill, first reading.
Members, the question is that the New Zealand Horticultural Export Authority Amendment Bill be considered by the Primary Production Committee. Those of that opinion will say aye. And to... Thank goodness for that. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. I call on Government Order of the Day number 3.
Wildlife